Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Emily Kure. I'm Percona's Digital Marketing Manager here. We'll begin in just a moment, but first I'd like to conduct a bit of housekeeping. Can you please raise your hand using the hand icon located in the GoToWebinar control panel to let me know that you can hear me? Perfect. Next, during this webinar, you will be on mute. Should you have any questions during the discussion, please enter them in the questions field within the control panel. At the end of the webinar, we'll take time to answer as many questions as possible. Those that aren't addressed will be answered in a follow-up blog entry on Percona's database performance blog. In addition, a recording of this webinar will be made available to everyone within 48 hours or less, along with the slides. I'd like to thank you for attending today's webinar, Security and Encryption in the MySQL World, presented by Solutions Engineer Demo. With that said, I'll turn the floor over to Demo.
Okay, perfect. So hello, everyone. Thank you for attending, first of all. So today I'm going to discuss some security best practices. So this is actually a one-on-one talk that actually goes over the functionalities, important items, etc. So let me just start, first of all, by just telling who I am. So I'm a solution engineer in Percona, which means that I know a little bit of the technical backgrounds from our consultancy department, our services, our products, etc. So I worked in MySQL space for over 8 years now. My Twitter handle is Demo. Of course, that's more of my personal views, but you're always welcome to add me on Twitter. And this is not the most pretty picture I've ever taken of myself. Well, that's me. So what I will discuss today and where I will actually work on today is specifically on we'll start by defining what a security mindset is, and we're going to look at from an infrastructure standpoint. Infrastructure means, for example, for example, where are you hosting your database servers? Are you hosting them, for example, in your own data center? Do you use the cloud? Are you actually having on-premise services? What type of security protocols are you using? So those things are very important, and it continues then to the level of the operating system, which is more of a backbone for your database environment potentially. And also from an application standpoint, it's very important to have a security mindset from the initial analysis actually, so that you actually keep track of what can be handled, what is potentially a problem, what data is very important to you, etc. Additionally, we'll also cover some MySQL privileges that you have to keep in mind, some items that you want to watch out for. We'll discuss SSL communication, so encryption during transit. We'll discuss also, because it's typically a very popular subject these days in this ransomware world these days. So we'll discuss how you can handle it. Very high level, but we'll discuss what you have to keep in mind, and we'll also discuss some encryption options you have within MySQL right now. So having the correct mindset is always very important. So applications should always be written with security from the ground up. Think of it. It depends, of course, what type of data you're handling, right? So if you're just handling, for example, some gaming metadata, maybe it's less important that you actually have very, very strict security policies. But for example, for financial transactions, it's very, very important that you limit the access actually to the database itself. And it also starts with the application. The application needs to be written correctly so that you actually limit, for example, SQL injections and other items. So keep in mind security whenever you're developing the application itself. And make sure that your sysadmins and dev teams also have that mindset internally in their
Sorry, folks. I think we just lost sound there for a second. We'll just give it a moment.
make the correct choices in the end, because what you want to avoid is that sensitive data can actually leave your premises, be kept as a ransom, or actually that your servers are compromised, right? So also inside, make sure that you understand that being compromised is something that everybody will get into that situation, that maybe sometime that there is maybe some server or desktop or something compromised, either by a virus, either by an exploit, etc. During your system engineering period, you will notice these types of issues coming up in some situations. Let me just say it like that. In regards to having the correct mindset, what is important is that you make sure that you restrict remote access, that you have a restrictive mindset instead of having a completely open mindset, right? What do I mean by that? Is the moment that somebody what needs access specifically, is that you try to understand what do I need to him to what is actually necessary that he has access to, and how can I limit him to protect himself and protect your data in accessing only the required data set, for example. Additionally, what is also important is that understand on what infrastructure you're working for. Make sure that you understand that when you're using the cloud, it also means that you're actually hosting yourself or hosting your database set on other people's computers. So it means that at that point, solutions like encryptions, think of, for example, in the Amazon cloud, like EBS encryption, becomes something quite important and could be essential, actually, to make sure that you're actually in a secure situation. Again, that restrictive mindset. Make sure that you actually think about security prior to deploying in production, for example, right? Or even during the application analysis. From an infrastructure point, what comes into mind immediately the moment that we're talking about security is actually the network. So a lot of people actually choose, in regards to secured networking environments, to segregate their network. Right, so making sure that only application servers can be able to connect to the database remotely, right? So, and what do I mean by segregation? Is that, for example, people will use a virtual network or a subnet specifically, or a network which is protected through firewalling to contain only the most sensitive databases. And what do I mean by that? You can have, for example, a red network, which only has essential database environment. For example, also very sensitive files, etc. And you can connect through an orange network, for example, which are the application servers, through a firewall, which actually has very strict limitations on who can access the infrastructure. So only application servers should also be able to connect to the database remotely. And I mean then, for example, from another network specifically, if necessary, right? On dev access and general access, I would recommend, don't say it's a requirement, but I would recommend that people use a Bastion, a jump host. Why is that? Because it's much harder to control actually the client desktops. Maybe you're using external contracts. Maybe you're using, maybe you don't have a visibility of what type of machines are connecting to the system itself. It's always nicer that you actually have a jump host where you can actually enforce security protocols, which are actually the first point where your developers or your sysadmins will connect to. Do not open it up to the internet. If you look, for example, at this link, you will see the shodan.io link that I'm showing there. You will see, for example, that there are a lot of MySQL servers in the field which are open to the internet. It's something which is problematic still, right? So it means that people can actually just connect to 3306 and start trying to guess passwords and users and stuff like that. Make sure that you don't open it up to the internet. And especially also in regards to the cloud, there's way too many people who actually open up, for example, in AWS, immediately their MySQL database server to 0.0.0.0, which actually means that you're actually giving access to everybody outside, where you can actually, and it opens up for potential problems. Inside a network, especially the moment that you're very, very deeply concerned about security, it might be interesting that you actually look at penetration security tools and detection tools like Snort, Pro Network Security Monitor, OSSEC. Those are tools which are very popular. They're also open source, and they give you immediate insight of security concerns that you might have on the networking level. So from an infrastructure perspective, network is very, very important. Keep in mind, though, that of course physical access is also very sensitive, right? So if you're working, for example, with a dedicated data center, sometimes it might be necessary, especially in really sensitive healthcare situations or financial situations, that you have specific rack cages necessary, right? So a separate part of the data center required, which requires additional security protocols to enter, etc. Make sure that you actually start thinking about security from the ground up. Of course, it depends. It's a balance of it's a balance, right? So limiting and restricting has the negative part of being less flexible and less easy to maybe develop for. So think about what's really necessary, how sensitive your data is, and what is required from a security perspective. Be friends with your network engineer. Make sure that he understands why it has to be restrictive. Make sure that also if he gets the request from development or an operation team or anybody else to have access to the database, that he actually says no to them, and that you can, or that he actually reverts to you guys, that you can actually limit the potential access to the database infrastructure. Again, be restrictive. Be positive, but be restrictive. On the operating system on operating system level, first of all. So what I think is very important to note is that it's very important to deploy security patches as soon as possible. And what do I mean by that is that way too many times you still see, for example, very, very ancient versions of MySQL still running. And what I mean by ancient versions is, for example, a 5.5 with a very low minor version, for example, right? So that means that nobody actually thought of that. Potentially, there are a lot of security updates that might be required from the MySQL level. It also starts with other services which are inside the operating system itself. So make sure that you deploy your security patches, and also don't be afraid to reboot the server, right? So there are way too many servers which are still running an older kernel, for example. Make sure that you have a maintenance window. If you have high availability, make sure that you can actually switch to the other server, reboot the old master, for example, and then return to that master the moment that is back on. Make sure that you use your high availability technology also to perform maintenance potentially, right? So keep that in mind, that security patches are important, but it doesn't stop with just installing them. You also potentially need to reboot your server. Also, the file permissions should be correct. So make sure that MySQL is the owner of the data directory. It will actually complain if it's not the owner already, right? So, but make sure that it should be the owner. Don't use 777 on your files, right? Keep that in mind, because actually, potentially, for example, if people have access, if you have, for example, 777 on your plugins, it's potentially possible to perform external code or something like that, modify the code, and actually, exploit actually your MySQL database. A safe bet is, for example, 750 on the directory, 0640 on your files, right? So another item which typically is disabled by default in a lot of situations, actually SA Linux, right? So you have that potential to use SA Linux on Red Hat machines or AppArmor, right? Depending on what type of solution that you're using. Maybe putting it on 0 and disabling it is maybe not the best solution. Try to put it maybe first in permissive mode, right? So that you can log where the access is, and then modify your templates to make sure that you actually can activate SA Linux. Normally, it also should work, right? So make sure that you actually test it, verify it. And that starts with whenever you guys are starting to create a MySQL database. Think about activating SA Linux. It protects you in a way. Also, if PCI compliant, quite often people actually go towards an encrypted file system. And I think also in the cloud, it's definitely valuable to actually use EBS encryption, because it's something that gives you, in some way, an encryption at rest solution, right? So from on the system itself, of course. So it starts at medium sizes on Amazon. So I'm sorry, but in micro, it's not something which is standardly included. But still, you can base yourself then on encryptFS or LUX or something else. Also, for example, in RPMs, use trusted package sources, right? So make sure that you use the Red Hat package sources if you're using Red Hat, and the EPEL package sources for Red Hat specifically. Make sure that you watch out with anything which is compiled um, outside the trusted resources that you have. Also, make sure that you have a patching policy. Maybe you want to patch your service on a regular basis. Maybe you want to do it based on CVE warnings that you get. Maybe you want to think about a patching policy. Again, security is also a mindset, right? So it means that at the end, it's something you have to keep in mind of. In typically, you will have a chief security officer in larger organizations, but essentially from an operations team, it's really recommended that you already think about, well, okay, well, I've set up a new infrastructure in MySQL. Well, how will I keep that patched up? How will I perform maintenance on it? Those are all items that you have to keep in mind whenever setting up the infrastructure as it is. Also, and this is something from XKCD, I think it's very important that you perform on the application's penetration tests. So make sure that you verify if you can do SQL injection. Validate that you can do correct user inputs. Can you perform modifications from the user inputs, which actually can be painful, right? So like the drop table students in this example. Make sure that you sanitize anything from the application stack and verify. You can use either external people to validate it, right? So validate if you are prone to validate, for example, penetration tests, or you can do it yourself. So make sure that you do a complete verification on what is possible and what is sensitive. What I think is always interesting to do is actually use configuration management. It may sound sometimes a little bit overkill, especially in smaller organizations, but make sure that you have actually compliancy, right? So it makes sure that you actually can provide, make sure that you can manage your users, the data files, the configuration files, etc. And for example, this is an example for Puppet. In this regard, you can say, okay, demo at localhost, make sure it's present. You can actually limit for me the maximum amount of connections per hour, the maximum queries per hour, updates per hour. And what does it actually limit specifically is maybe you don't want support team which has, for example, access to the database. You want to limit the amount of connections they open up so that you actually limit the resources that are used by this, because you actually want your application to use most, right? So if you use a configuration management tool, you can actually automate this and make sure that you have a complete list of requirements and enforce it, right? So in my opinion, that's definitely valuable. And the tools are open, right? So you have Ansible, you have Chef, Puppet, whatever you specifically prefer. Good thing about it is specifically that it will help you roll out your configuration files. And the item which I like the best is that it has compliancy, right? So if you have, for example, people who are doing reviews on the security inside your organization, compliancy is typically something which is very important. And it means actually that you have consistency on constant basis of the configuration files. So it means that, for example, you cannot actually change configuration without it being overridden by, for example, Puppet, right? So and you need to do the modifications in the configuration tool instead of performing it locally. So the configuration management tool can actually help you also to perform the OS security updates on a regular basis, help you with resource limitations, and it essentially also documents the environment, because in the end, with configuration, with performing restrictions, what you also want is making sure that you actually document who you give access, what the typical configuration is. If you have configuration management, essentially the environment is already documented, maybe in something which is less readable, like a configuration management tool, but at least you have something which is interesting and can be, for example, even put in a version control system, so that you actually can verify what the what the history was. It also makes sure that you have less manual work, which means that it means that you actually need less access to the database itself, and you can actually, well, you are less prone for potential errors. In regards to MySQL privileges, we're talking about a different type of set, right? So what I think is important on that level is that you limit your user privileges to key application servers. And what do I mean by that is that you don't want everybody to be able to connect to the server. That's essentially what. And make sure that you're restrictive to your users. What do your users need to connect on? Can you limit it on? Can you limit for, do they just need access, for example, to an activity log table? Just give them access to the activity log table. Limit what they can actually do with the database. Also, make use of the password validation plugin. It's something that you can activate with MySQL 5.7, and actually it works quite well. It actually provides you it will actually warn the user when they're not using a long enough password when they're changing it. So make sure that you use complex passwords and not a generic password for everybody. This is just an example with MySQL secure installation, and you can see, well, you have actually in the validation policy a possibility that just says low, in which that the length is just larger than 8. You have a medium, which means that the length is just larger than 8 or same as 8, numeric, mixed case, and special characters. And that's required. And there's a strong that actually also verifies if there's dictionary words in there, which is important to keep in mind, right? So, so be also aware that passwords need to be validated correctly, right? So make sure that you use the validation plugin. Password requirements, again, use strict policy along your organization. In some cases, for example, it might make sense to use, for example, the PAM authentication plugin, which is actually inside Percona server. It's also available for MariaDB. There's also one in MySQL Enterprise. But the idea is that you then can link it to your centralized LDAP server, for example, and make sure that the authentication is done through that verification system. Because typically those types of solutions can be, well, you can actually add specific verifications on the complexity, also on the password on that level. So think about what you specifically want to do it, but for example, a PAN authentication plugin might be actually essential, an interesting tool. Also, don't use root as a standard access user to your database. Still, way too many people do that, right? So they just have a standard root user with a generic password that they never renew. Watch out with this, right? So because maybe somebody will get out of your organization at a certain point, but he still will remember that password. People still write passwords down, so watch out, especially with root as a standard access, or make sure that you limit that. In regards to MySQL, MySQL is typically quite handy, right? So we identify users typically based on users at host, and that can be the host name, the IP, or the network. You can actually use wet wildcards, which in some cases I don't really recommend because it could be bad, right? So think of the 0.0.0.0 in Amazon, and at that point, if you would connect somebody, well, you could connect from anywhere, which is maybe what you want, but it's not preferred. Let me just say it like that. It typically could be quite dangerous. So examples, for example, it will be demo at localhost, a specific IP address, or it could even be a subnet, right? So which a network that can only connect to the server. So for creating a user, very simple, create a user, drop user. Please do use drop user specifically when somebody leaves the organization. Don't leave access in your infrastructure. Again, automation like Puppet or Ansible or anything else can help you with this, right? So it will actually provide you with an ability to just change it on a centralized place, and then your servers will pick it up and modify the user access. Also make sure that you grant the user a specific kind of privilege. Don't just grant all to everybody, right? So make sure that you limit what they actually can do. If you have somebody who just needs to be able to verify what's been for example, entries on the database, make sure that they only have select. Don't make sure that they have inserts, or especially not deletes and updates, right? So make sure that you limit what people can do to it. Typically, applications will need to have insert, select, update, and delete. In way too many documentation files, for example, for tools, people will actually, well, application will say that, well, I want grant all with grant up with grant all on all the data or on everything to my application name at everywhere, and also with the grant option. You don't want that, right? So make sure that you limit what is specifically necessary for your application. Again, discuss it with your developers. Verify this with the vendor of your application potentially. You can actually set also a password expiration policy inside MySQL, which might be interesting specifically from a user's access perspective. And again, watch out in regards to providing all privileges, grant options, or even super. Because if you have super, for example, it means that you can actually essentially kill queries potentially, right? Which is something that you don't want people to be able to do that don't have actually the required access privileges. Also, you have the possibility to perform user account blocking. That might be interesting for people who temporarily leave the organization, for example, and come back. It might be interesting. Again, limit the resources. I gave the example already on the Puppet entry, but the idea is essentially that you limit how much queries, for example, per hours a user can do. It's not something which is very popular, let me just say it like that, but it essentially might be interesting, especially for your support team or someone else or operations team. So they actually limit the resource constraint that you put on your database environment. Then encryption at transit, right? So I would recommend specifically in regards to cloud solutions that you start thinking about this, right? So putting in SSL encryption as a standard for your connection itself. It's definitely something which might be required for PCI and other security compliances. However, on a heavy loaded database server, keep in mind that there might be a slight performance penalty. It's typically negligible, but it's something that you might want to be aware of the moment that you're actually introducing it on a system which already has problems with a specific load. And especially, again, AWS and RDS users, do it, right? So because you're actually working on infrastructure where you cannot really 100% control the traffic or the network specifically, so it might be beneficial that you use SSL. So ransomware, right? Ransomware is that funny little thing that well, funny. It's awful if it happens to you, but it also happens on databases, right? So make sure that you have that patching policy, right? Make sure that you apply all updates. Keep track of the news on that level also, right? So make sure that when you apply all the updates, that you also restart your machine, right? So restart the required services. Do some verification. When is it the last time that you actually rebooted your database server? Additionally, limit the access to trusted services and users, right? So it might be an edge case, but maybe someone, for example, with a laptop. Again, if you don't have a Bastion server and it actually just connects directly to the database server, it might be prone for you want to limit actually the access towards from external accesses. Also make sure, and I think that's very, very important, that you have backups locally and offsite. And what do I mean with backups locally and offsite, and preferably also encrypted backups? Make sure that you have something that you can recover quickly from, and also something in which that you can actually recover, for example, if your backup location becomes compromised. And that can be potentially somewhere you can store it, maybe in S3. You can store it in another object store externally. In some cases, people use a tape device and actually use a taxi service to, for example, push the tapes towards another secured location just to make 100% sure that it's not residing inside a network. And make sure that you test them, right? So you don't have backups if you don't test them. What do I mean by that is that you're not 100% sure that you actually have backups before you've actually copied them. So maybe use your backups to populate, for example, your test infrastructure, like your quality assurance infrastructure, etc. So make sure that you verify and test your the backups of the environment correctly. And you want to avoid that, that you're in that case, you will be able to actually circumvent these types of situations that you have to pay somebody to actually get your data back, right? So that's something that everybody wants to avoid. In regards to encryption, so encrypting the file system is still the most popular with encryptFS, for example, right? So there's a possibility to do table level encryption. Keep in mind that the keyring solution is only currently in the enterprise edition. There's also encryption functionality for the moment in MariaDB. So there is table level encryption also in Percona server. So that's maybe interesting to know. That actually provides you with encryption at rest functionality on the MySQL data file, right? So encrypting your file system is more from the file system specifically. Of course, if people have not physical access, but access, and they log in, typically that file system is mounted, right? We're using the security key, and at that point, of course, your data is still sensitive, right? But it at least protects you for some malicious use cases. So I would say encryption might be beneficial, especially also if your policy is required. So I think it's really important. But keep in mind, encryption on disk and encryption at transit both have different targets, right? So the encryption at transit might avoid you to have middleman in the middle attacks. Encryption at rest is, for example, if somebody has physical access to the infrastructure, right? So those things keep that in mind, that it might be beneficial, but of course you have to choose what use case you really need. Inside Percona server, there's something which is, in my opinion, quite interesting also from a security perspective. What you have to keep in mind is specifically the audit plugin, which is in Percona server. The audit plugin will actually show you, will monitor actually and log the connections and query activity that's used on a specific MySQL server. And it will log that information in an XML file or in a JSON file. And the idea is that you actually can see what type of traffic is actually passing towards your database. And it might be beneficial, for example, if something that is, for example, required from your organization, but it actually also gives you real input on what type of traffic has actually passed through to your database. Keep in mind, though, that, for example, it will just log the query. It will log, for example, connections. It will log actually the events that happen on the database itself. It also can push information to syslog, for example. In my opinion, this type of tool might be essential, specifically if you're thinking from a security policy perspective, so that you can actually verify what specifically has happened to your database, so that you can see also what type of access patterns that you see in the database, for example. Another item from a security perspective, especially, I mentioned already the PAM plugin. I would recommend using it maybe in some cases, is to disable load data local info. So what is important in that is that if you enable that, how can it be dangerous, right? So for example, on servers that you cannot trust, right? So if you do load data in local info, potentially your database, the database server you're connecting to, can actually fetch information from the client itself. So keep in mind that load data, local info might be something dangerous. You can actually also disable it from the server because it works also in different ways, right? So so that's something that I would recommend also to disable if that's possible for you. But most important, what I would like you to understand from this talk is make sure that you're restrictive, right? Make sure that you're restrictive in regards to what you really what you can access, what users can access from the database perspective, what applications can access, and make sure that you actually keep track of your security requirements the moment that you're actually doing the analysis of the application. So remember to be restrictive, right? So, but positive also. So that's it in regards to the presentation itself. If I don't know if you have any questions, so I'm happy to answer them.
Thank you so much for that. At this time, go ahead and enter your questions in the questions field down below, and we'll take time to answer as many questions as we can. A friendly reminder for those that we couldn't address today, they will be addressed in a follow-up blog entry. All right, so our first question is, I use wildcards such as user at % for replication user. Any other way to achieve this without using a wildcard?
Yes, so you can actually, well, if you're using it, for example, for replication specifically, you can actually also limit the server that actually can access the the master, for example, right? So you can actually tell what you can actually limit it. So you can actually say the server name, the host name, or the IP address. It depends a little bit on what you're trying to do. So the moment that you have a fixed IP address, for example, from where the slave or secondary server is connecting from, I would say limit that, right? So you can actually limit that. That's not a problem. Also, you can actually have multiple entries, right? So for the same user with different host names or IP addresses.
Oh, thank you. Let's see, our next question is, we operate from a virtual environment, a virtual box and a Vagrant, and most of our developers connect from a SQL editor such as Workbench, Toad, Heady SQL. Using localhost as a hostname for user creation seems impossible with that setup, hence causing us to use a wildcard. How can I best go about not using a wildcard?
So I would say that you can still use a wildcard, but make sure that it's limited to a specific network, right? So those people typically people who have, for example, MySQL Workbench typically will do it through a secured environment or a secured network. Let me just say it like that, like a site-to-site VPN or something. That you can already limit it, for example, on the network level to make sure that only people inside the network can actually access it. So using wildcards is something that I would, well, it's acceptable, but keep in mind, you lose flexibility when you're really restrictive. What you can do is also limit what they can specifically access, right? So make sure that you watch out, well, how can do they need access to specific tables? Do they need access to specific databases? Don't only focus, of course, on the wildcards. They're important, but, well, try to find something which is workable for you guys. I hope that answers it a little bit.
Thank you. Let's see, our next question is, how does the encryption table and in transit work, and how to set them up in Percona?
Okay, so the encryption at transit is actually something which is it's standard SSL communication, right? So you have to create a key file. You can configure it actually inside your my.cnf. So what I can do is I will do in the blog post specifically. I will tell you how you can activate it specifically, because I think that makes more sense, so that you have actually something that you can relate to. But it's actually quite well documented, and I will point also specifically to interesting documentation of that. I'll just write that down at the same time.
Thank you. Let's see. Our next question is, can we use TLS instead of SSL, as SSL is not that secure anymore?
Yes. Yes. So definitely you can use TLS with MySQL. That's not a problem.
Okay. Let's see. How to do bulk insert? What is the best method to handle without a load data local in file?
Bulk inserts, well, it depends, right? So you can actually, so you can still do it, right? So the thing is, what you have to do is make sure that you limit it, right? So, and you can actually limit it. There is actually explanation on the development page of MySQL specifically what you have to watch out for with load data local in file, right? So, because in some use cases, it's the only way that you can do it, right? So whenever you want to do bulk inserts, what you also can do is, of course, when you do bulk inserts, is actually use really MySQL queries to import the data specifically inside MySQL specifically. So yeah, it depends. It depends. I would say what I would just want to say specifically, what watch out with the load data local in file is specifically when you don't use it, because it's still standard functionality which is included in it, right? So make sure that you watch out with it standard.
Let's see. Our next question is, the minor performance, is this a big deal? And if we have a very heavy workload, minor performance related with SSL enabled, sorry.
Yeah, I would say test it, right? So especially on heavily loaded environments, make sure that you verify if it's actually something problematic for you. So especially with SSL or TLS encryption, it's just, it might give you a performance overhead. How much? Difficult to predict, to be honest, right? So, but it will have some performance overhead. I cannot really tell you if it will be a problem for you. So really make sure that you test it in a low testing environment, for example.
Okay. Our next question is I already have MySQL 5.7. How can I enable password complexity?
So it's actually just a plugin that you have to activate. The password validation plugin. So for example, if you just do MySQL secure installation, it will activate it automatically the moment that you say that it has to be activated. So if you press in MySQL secure installation, you can also activate it separately by activating the plugin itself. If you want, I will also put that in the blog post itself, how you activate it specifically for MySQL 5.7.
Thank you. We have a triple PXE setup that is hosted with Docker containers that are on their own subnet with a proxy SQL to the application servers. And their data stores are hosted on SSDs that are encrypted with LUKS. What else could we do to further increase our security?
So what I would say specifically, so you're already using Docker. So in my opinion, what might be interesting is that you use some sort of, as I mentioned, some sort of form of automation. Why is that? Specifically for compliancy purposes, right? So that might be something which is beneficial. Additionally to that, I would say that you can use tools like AID or something else to verify also if configuration files are tampered with. Additionally, what might be also additionally beneficial, in my opinion, is again, you still need some sort of limitations on the user access, right? So you can use proxy SQL to limit it and to actually protect your databases, but make sure that you also, again, verify that your databases are limited from themselves too. Also make sure that you have, for example, firewall limitations so that only your proxy SQL database, your proxy SQL proxy actually, just your proxy can actually only connect to the database, or for example, that other users can connect them through TLS or SSL. So those are the things that come from the top of my mind. Let me just say it like that.
Thank you, Dima. With regards to an audit log plugin, are there any special ways that this can be utilized other than just logging queries, such as reporting failed login attempts or queries that failed due to insufficient authorization?
That's actually a very good question. So in regards to audit log, indeed. So what it does is, of course, it logs specific events, right? So um, in regards to the audit plugin itself, it also has some functionalities in which that you actually can filter, right? So this type of accounts that are that you want to perform logging on, and you also can actually filter on the SQL command type, right? So what type of SQL command is being performed? Like for example, once everybody logged who is doing create DB or drop DB. Let's hope that people do drop DB. You can also limit it by variable specifically. So in regards to being specifically warned if one specific event happens, I think that's typically something which is a bit more difficult. I can verify that to be 100% sure and tell you if that's possible. But typically people do the limitation from the logging tool they're using themselves, right? So I don't know. I will check on that though. I will add that also in the blog post. So not a definite answer on that level.
All right, thank you so much for that. Let's see, our next question is, can you describe the best practice for rotating the encryption keys when used for table encryption using the file-based keyring? We do have an encryption file system as well, so the keyring is secure for the most part.
So not really at this point, right? So it's something that I need to verify. I can make sure that it's also documented in the blog post because that's really something specific, and I want to also clarify that properly and make sure that I give you a really good, correct answer on that level because I would say it depends for the moment.
Okay. Let's see. Our next question is, why do you need to consider rebooting the server every so often? And is there a best practice for how often it is that we should be
Yeah,
rebooting?
I know. Everybody is afraid of rebooting the server. I understand that. That's logical, also, right? So it's something that people want to avoid typically. Thing what you have to keep in mind is that whenever there's sensitive kernel updates that are important, I would say it's important to potentially reboot your environment, right? So make sure that it's active. It's essentially it's not required at every time, and I would not recommend doing that constantly, right? So what I would do in regards to the situation that you guys are in is something whenever you guys have a maintenance window for your database infrastructure, maintenance has to happen anyway on infrastructure anyway, right? So even on the cloud-based environment, etc., it needs to be done. So that you actually perform that reboot 10, right? So make sure that you actually restart the MySQL servers. Make use of your high availability solution whenever you're doing that failover, so that you can actually limit downtime. But again, you need maintenance time whenever you're having a database or an application server, specifically for those types of situations, right? So, and I think it's even more sensitive with application servers or web servers, etc. That actually happens on a regular basis, in between quotes, on a in just make sure that you're not running for 10 years on the same kernel, for example. That's the idea. You have to make sure that you actually think about it and see what is the acceptable maintenance window for your infrastructure.
Okay. Is there third tools or plugins provides for an asymmetric encryption functions like MySQL Enterprise encryption does?
Not at this point. No, not in Percona server at this point. So there's of course the table level encryption, but there's not in regards to the MySQL encryption functionality at this point, if I understand that correctly. I can go deeper on that on the blog posts because maybe my thoughts are flawed on that. So I want to make sure that I answer you correctly on that level.
Okay, thank you. Can we use PT Online to connect to a MySQL server with SSL enabled?
PT Online schema change. That's a good question. So typically it uses actually a MySQL connector, right? So I would say yes, but I need to verify.
All right. Is there any audit tool or penetration tool to test the security of MySQL server?
Not that I know of at this point. So most penetration tools are typically hosted on well, nothing that is specifically thinking of in the open source world that I know of at this point. The penetration tools for the moment that I know most of are all based on the application server or web servers at this point.
Is there any database versioning tool to secure a database for user error?
So user error typically user error typically means that you have, for example, deletes, right? It starts essentially first of all by limiting your users on performing those types of queries, right? Which is logical in my opinion. So making sure that only people who think twice actually have those types of access. But user error typically still happens. So there are ways to circumvent that and actually protect yourself by it. And that's honestly mostly backups and specifically also delayed saves, for example, right? So in which that you actually can easily recover in dire situations of those. Best practice, however, in my opinion, is making sure that you don't allow users to connect to your production database and have the ability to perform deletes or kill queries or drop databases, right? So make sure that you actually limit that type of functionality, or make sure that they have a slave to fetch that to perform not modifications, but actually fetch information from it, etc., and have complete access.
Thanks. Let's see. If we're using an org network hostname in user creation for developers and application, will we have to use an SSH to connect? This is not straightforward for some SQL editors. Any thoughts?
So if you use a proxy, for example, with Workbench, you can connect through SSH, right? So that's a possibility. What you can also do is, of course, limit it through a VPN connection, for example, right? The thing is that, in my opinion, what you would be able to do is, so most editors, as far as I know, have accessibility through SSH through port forwarding, for example. If that's not possible, I would recommend you to limit the user access rights that they have on the database itself and activate logging, right? So audit logging.
Is there any specific security I can set for MySQL via OSSEC, OSSEC?
Not that I know of. But I need to check that, so I can verify that with our security specialist inside our team.
Thank you.
And I will put it on the blog posts.
The Percona monitoring tool, can this help for security?
So you mean by Percona monitoring and management? So the thing is, within Percona monitoring and management, there are two tools typically included in it, right? So what you can look at from a tool perspective is that, first of all, you have something which is called QAN, which is a query analytics tool. And secondarily, you have something which is based on Grafana, which is actually trending solution for your MySQL database. So from a monitoring perspective for the users itself, at this point, I don't think so. But it is definitely something interesting, and I will verify if there's anything on the works on that, or if there's already something in place for that.
Thank you.
I think from that perspective, it's mostly from the audit log that you're interested in that, right?
Let's see. Our next question is, when we enable a password validation plugin, how can you test the strength of the password?
So the thing is, it will actually complain if the password is not correct, right? So not following the correct type of functionality. Of course, it's more difficult on existing infrastructures, right? So keep that in mind. Essentially, the plugin itself, the moment that you're modifying the password itself, it will complain if the password is not following the correct pattern. Just writing that down also. Okay. So that's what I can say from it from the moment. So it's specifically during creation of the password that it will start complaining.
Well, thank you so much for that demo. So we are actually getting close to the top of the hour, and it looks like we've actually got time for a couple more questions. So make sure to go ahead and submit those in now. Let's see. Our next question is, do we have to create SSL certs in order to establish keyring encryption rings? Keys, sorry.
Yes, that's typically something that is required. But you don't. So yes, but you can just create RSA keys, for example. Yes, I would say so.
Let's see. Our next question. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No worries. No worries.
Does Bracona offer security consulting services?
It depends on what, right? So specifically on MySQL database perspective, we can definitely assist you guys in identifying what is potentially problematic with it. That typically happens that we verify, for example, your user access parameters on that level. And it's something that we can focus on specifically from a consultancy perspective. Yes.
All right. Well, thank you so much for that demo. So I think that's all the questions that we can squeeze in for today. Thank you so much, everybody, for attending. And thank you so much, Demo, for presenting today. It was a very great webinar, and we learned a lot about security. And we hope to see you on our next webinar series.
Thank you, guys. Thank you, Emily.